Now I will tell you something troubling about 5th grade. It isn't as troubling as what happens later in the story when my father lets rain outside during a hurricane, but it is still troubling. For the first time in my life, I'm being sent home with weekly progress reports that I have to give to my father. The reports are written by Mrs. Liebler and read and signed by Mrs. Kuschel, which is my teacher's way of saying that they're in agreement about my behavior. The reports list all of my notable behaviors for Monday through Friday. Some of the comments are nice, such as the ones about when I participate appropriately in a classroom discussion. But most of the comments make my father slam the reports onto the table and say, "Rose, for God's sake, keep your mouth closed when you think of a homonym," or, "Do you see any of the other kids clapping their hands over their ears and screaming when they hear the fire alarm?" In the last report, Mrs. Liebler and Mrs. Kuschel asked my father to schedule monthly meetings with them. Now he's supposed to go to Hatford Elementary on the third Friday of every month at 3:45 p.m. to discuss me. This is what he said when he read that. "I don't have time for meetings. This is way too much trouble, Rose. Why do you do these things?" He said that at 3:48 p.m. on a Friday when there was no work for him at the JR garage. Uncle Weldon heard about the monthly meetings on October 3rd at 8:10 in the evening when he was visiting my father and Rain and me. My father was standing at the front door, holding the letter in his hand and gazing out at the trees and the darkness. "These meetings are crap," he said. Uncle Weldon, who was sitting at the Formica kitchen table with me, looked at my father from under his eyelashes and said, "I could go, if you want." Uncle Weldon has a very soft voice. My father whipped around and pointed his finger at Weldon. "No, Rose is my responsibility. I can take care of things." Weldon lowered his head and didn't answer. But when my father turned around so that he was facing outside again, my uncle held up 2 crossed fingers, which was his signal to me that everything would be all right, right. I held up my fingers too, and we each touched our hearts with them. After that, Rain came into the kitchen and sat on my feet for a while. Then my uncle left. Then my father crumpled the letter from Mrs. Liebler and Mrs. Kuschel and tossed it into the yard. That is the end of the introduction to me. 2. My dog, Rain. The next character in my true story is Rain. A character doesn't have to be a human being. A character can be an animal, such as a dog named Rain. Rain weighs 23 pounds. This is how you weigh a dog. You stand on the scales and weigh yourself. Then you pick up the dog and weigh yourself and the dog together. Then you subtract your weight from the weight of you and the dog together, and that's how much the dog weighs. Weigh and weigh are homonyms. Rain's back is 18 inches long. From the tip of her nose to the tip of her tail, she's 34 inches long. Rain's fur is mostly yellow. 7 of her toes are white, 2 on her right front paw, 1 on her left front paw, 3 on her right back paw, and 1 on her left back paw. Her right ear has brown speckles on it. Her fur is short. Uncle Weldon says she looks sort of like a yellow Labrador retriever. Since a female purebred yellow lab should weigh 55 to 70 pounds, Rain is probably not a purebred yellow lab. When Rain and I are at home alone together, we sit inside or on the front porch and Rain puts one of her front feet in my lap. I rub her toes, and she gazes into my blue eyes with her eyes, which are the color of a chocolate bar. After a while, she starts to fall asleep. Her brown eyes squint shut until they're completely closed. At bedtime she crawls under the covers with me. If I wake up during the night, I find that Rain has smashed her body against mine and rested her head across my neck. Rain's breath smells like dog food. Rain has lived with us for 11 months, which is almost 1 year. I will tell you more about the night my father brought her home in another chapter, Chapter 5, which will be called When We Got Rain. The first part 1. Who I am, a girl named Rose. I am Rose Howard and my first name has a homonym. To be accurate, it has a homophone, which is a word that's pronounced the same as another word but spelled differently. My homophone name is Rose. Most people say homonym when they mean homophone. My teacher, Mrs. Kuschel, says this is a common mistake. What's the difference between making a mistake and breaking a rule? I want to know. Making a mistake is accidental. Breaking a rule is deliberate. But if I start to say, Mrs. Kuschel rushes on. It's all right to say homonym when we mean homophone. That's called a colloquialism. Breaking has a homonym, I tell her. Breaking. I like homonyms a lot. And I like words, rules and numbers too. Here is the order in which I like these things. 1. Words, especially homonyms. 2. Rules 3. Numbers, especially prime numbers. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a true story, which makes it a piece of non-fiction. This is how you tell a story. First, you introduce the main character. I'm writing this story about me, so I am the main character. My first name has a homonym, and I gave my dog a homonym name too. Her name is Rain, which is special because it has two homonyms, Rain and Rain. I will write more about Rain in Chapter 2. Chapter 2 will be called My Dog, Rain, Rain, Rain. Something important about the word right is that it has three homonyms, right, right, and right. That's the only group of four homonyms I've thought of. If I ever think of another four homonym group, it will be a red letter day. I live with my father, Wesley Howard, and neither of his names has a homonym. From our porch you can see our front yard and our driveway and our road, which is called Hud Road. Road has two homonyms, road and road. On the other side of the road is a little forest, and through the trees you can see the New York Thruway. The word sea has a homonym, sea. But even better, seas has two homonyms, seas and seas. I'm in 5th grade at Hatford Elementary. There's only one elementary school in Hatford, New York, and only one 5th grade classroom in the school, and I'm in it. Most of my classmates are 10 years old or about to turn 11. I'm almost 12 because no one is sure what to do with me in school. I've stayed back for 2 semesters, which is a total of 1 year. 1/2 + 1/2 = 1. Some of the things I get teased about are following the rules and always talking about homonyms. Mrs. Liebler is my aide and she sits with me in Mrs. Kuschel's room. She sits in an adult-sized chair next to my 5th grade-sized chair and rests her hand on my arm when I blurt something out in the middle of math. Or, if I whop myself in the head and start to cry, she'll say, "Rose, do you need to step into the hall for a moment?" Mrs. Liebler tells me that there are things worth talking about besides homonyms and rules and prime numbers. She encourages me to think up conversation starters. Some conversation starters about me that do not have anything to do with homonyms or rules or prime numbers are, I live in a house that faces northeast. After I say that, I ask the person I'm trying to have a conversation with, and which direction does your house face? Down the road, 0.7 miles from my house is the JR garage, where my father sometimes works as a mechanic, and 0.1 miles farther along is a bar called the Luck of the Irish, where my father goes after work. There is nothing between my house and the JR garage except trees and the road. Tell me some things about your neighborhood. I have an uncle named Weldon, who is my father's younger brother. And who else is in your family? My official diagnosis is high-functioning autism, which some people call Asperger's syndrome. Do you have a diagnosis? I will finish up this part of my introduction by telling you that my mother does not live with my father and me. She ran away from our family when I was 2. Therefore, the people living in my house are my father and me. The dog living in our house is Rain. Uncle Weldon lives 3.4 miles away on the other side of Hatford. The next part of my introduction is the setting of my story. I've already told you my geographic location, Hud Road in Hatford, New York. The historical moment in time in which this story begins is October of my year in 5th grade. Rain and I have routines. We like routines. Rain stays at home alone on weekdays while I'm at Hatford Elementary and my father is at his job at the JR garage. When there isn't any work for my father at the JR garage, he usually goes to the Luck of the Irish where he drinks beer and watches television. One way or the other, he isn't at home. Rain stays in the house by herself. At 2:42 when school ends, Uncle Weldon picks me up. Then he drives me home. He drops me off between 2:58 and 3:01. Rain and I sit on the porch for a while and I rub her toes. Then we take a walk. Then I do my homework. Then I start dinner for my father and me. Then I feed Rain. What Rain eats is my pet dog food from a can, half a can in the morning and half a can in the evening, mixed with my pet dry food. When my father first brought Rain home he said she didn't need wet food, which is more expensive than dry food, but I said that dogs in the wild eat meat, and my father said, "You're right, Rose." After Rain's dinner we wait for my father to come home. If he's been at the Luck of the Irish all day, he might not be in a good mood. Or he might be in a very good mood. If he's been working at the JR garage, he might not be in a good mood. Or he might be in no particular mood. Rain is smart. She never goes near my father right away. She stands in the doorway to my bedroom while we wait to see whether my father will say, "What's for supper?" If he says, "What's for supper?" then it's safe for me to serve him and for Rain to sit by the table while we eat. She can stare at us and put her paws in our laps wanting food until I see my father's eyes get black and hard, and that's the signal that Rain should go back to my bedroom. If my father comes home and doesn't say anything, but walks into his own room, then Rain and I should not go near him at all. And I have to make Rain stay very quiet so she doesn't annoy him or give him a headache. Rain knows to stay away from my father's feet, and his shoes. 3. The rules of homonyms. I am the only student in my classroom who's interested in homonyms. This suggests to me that most kids are not interested in homonyms. So if you want to skip this chapter, it's all right. But if you read it, you might get interested in homonyms. If you are not interested in homonyms at all, stop reading here and skip to chapter 4. Homonyms can be surprising and fun, and that's why I started a list of them. The list is very long. Right now it takes up 4 sheets of paper. The words are in alphabetical order. I try to leave space between the pairs and trios of homonyms so that I can add new ones to the list easily. But if the spaces have gotten used up and I've thought of another set of homonyms, then I have to rewrite the list from that point on. Sometimes this makes me cry because I have to write the words perfectly, without making any mistakes. If I make a mistake, I have to start over. Josh Bartle, who is a 4 feet 10 inches boy in my classroom, said to me last week, "Rose, just keep the list in your computer. Then you can add in new words wherever you want. The computer will make spaces for you. You won't have to keep rewriting the list." But my father and I do not have a computer, or a cell phone, or a digital camera, or an iPod, or a DVD player. My father says those things are expensive and unnecessary. He says we can't afford them, and who needs them anyway? So my homonyms list is on paper. In this chapter I'm going to tell you about my rules for homonyms. But since I've realized that most kids aren't any more interested in rules than they are in homonyms, I'll tell you something fun about homonyms first. Then I'll get to the rules, and if you're still interested you can keep reading. What's fun about homonyms is hearing a word in a sentence and suddenly realizing that it has a homonym, or maybe 2 or 3, but that's so rare that I don't often think about homonym quartets, and that you haven't thought of that homonym pair or trio before. For instance, yesterday, Uncle Weldon said to me, "Look how carefully Rain chews her food." And just like that I had a new pair of homonyms to add to my list. Uncle Weldon and I were sitting at my kitchen table when he said that, and I jumped out of my chair and cried, "Oh, choose, and choose, that's a new homonym pair." Uncle Weldon gets excited about homonyms too, so he said, "Wonderful, Rose. Go find your list. Let's see if there's room for 2 more words." While I was getting the list out of my backpack, I thought about the word chew and how it rhymes with brew, and as I ran back to Uncle Weldon I began to shout again. And also there's bruise and bruise. Oh, that's a really good pair, 2 new pairs to add to my list. This is almost a red letter day. So, in conclusion, that is what's fun about homonyms. If you've heard enough about homonyms and you don't want to learn my rules, stop reading here and skip to chapter 4. Now, here are my rules of homonyms. It's important to have rules, because without them, you could get overwhelmed thinking of words that sound alike. Your list would be pages and pages and pages long. The purpose of most of my rules is to limit homonyms to words that are pure and also that are English. Rose Howard's rules of homonyms. 1. A true pair or trio of homonyms includes no proper nouns. A proper noun names a particular person or place or thing, such as Josh Bartle or Hatford or Rice Krispies cereal. I thought about including Cokes and Harold on my list, but Cokes and Harold are proper nouns, not pure words. Including proper nouns would make my list too long. Luckily, Rose and Rain are proper nouns and regular nouns, so I was able to include them on my list. 2. A true pair or trio of homonyms includes no foreign words. I put the words peak and peak on my list, but I did not add PK for a trio, because PK is a word of French origin. Including foreign words on my list would become very difficult, because I don't know all the languages. 3. A true pair or trio of homonyms includes no contractions. I'll and I'll are on my list, but I didn't add I'll because it's actually a contraction of the words I will. Therefore it doesn't count as a pure word. Besides, I is a proper noun. 4. A true pair or trio of homonyms includes no abbreviated words. I did not add ink and ink to my list because ink is short for incorporated, which is clearly not a homonym for ink. 5. A true pair or trio of homonyms includes only words that sound exactly alike. Since wine and wine do not sound exactly alike, they are not on my list. Neither are hall and hall. I guess that's enough about homonyms for now. You probably want to get on with my story anyway, so now it's time for me to introduce the next main character to you. The next main character is my father, Wesley Howard. Oh, one more fun thing about homonyms: the word pair implies two, but it is part of a homonym trio: pair, pair, and pair. 4. Some things about my father, whose name, Wesley Howard, does not have a homonym. Wesley Howard is my father and he's 33 years old. He was born on March 16 during a quarter moon. He's 6 feet 1 inch tall. He has a scar on his cheek that is 1.5 inches long. He got it when he was 7 and his father whacked him in the face with the handle of a shovel in order to teach him not to leave his bike outside. Some things about my father and me that are the same are that we grew up with our fathers but not our mothers, and that we live in the country. My father's profession is mechanic at the JR garage. My father has one sibling, my Uncle Weldon, who is 31 years old and 6 feet 0 inches tall. Uncle Weldon was born on June 23 during the kind of moon called a full strawberry moon. My father was born at 6:39 p.m. and my uncle was born at 9:36 p.m., so their birth times are opposite when written out. Also, the numbers are all divisible by 3. My father was 21 when I was born. He was 23 when my mother left. He was 26 and a half when I started kindergarten. He was 26 years and 7 months when my kindergarten teacher, Miss Kroon, told him that Hatford Elementary might not be the right school for me. I didn't know there was another elementary school in Hatford, my father replied. That isn't what I meant. What Miss Kroon meant was that since I was having trouble talking to the other kindergarteners and I cried a lot and was apt to hit myself in the head with a shoe or a picture book if somebody didn't follow the rules, I might need a special school or program. My father told Miss Kroon to work harder. Teaching me was her job. Are you sure you don't want to look into another program for Rose? Asked Miss Kroon. Where are the other programs? Asked my father. There's an excellent one in Mount Katrine. Mount Katrine that is 22 miles away. Yes. My father shook his head. Rose will be fine right here. In first grade, my teacher, Ms. Vinsel, called a meeting with the principal and the school psychologist and Miss Kroon and my father. I don't know what happened during the meeting because I wasn't there. After the meeting, my father picked me up at Uncle Weldon's office and took me home and shook me and said, "Rose, this behavior has got to stop." And I told him that you could write out my name 2 ways and both ways would be pronounced the same. For second grade 1 had Miss Kroon again because she didn't want to teach kindergarteners anymore. Miss Kroon said to my father on the afternoon of September 13th, "I believe Rose would benefit from spending part of every day in the resource room, Mr. Howard." Mr. Howard, who is my father, said, "That's fine with me as long as the resource room isn't for retards." For has 2 homonyms, 4 and 4. By fourth grade Mrs. Liebler had become my aide. My father said he didn't think I needed an aide, but that he wasn't going to fight Hatford Elementary. Just stay out of trouble, Rose, he told me. And everything was fine until 5th grade when Mrs. Liebler thought up the idea of weekly progress reports. Now I am going to go back in time to report on my father's childhood some more. When my father was 10 years old, he went to school with a brown-colored 2-inch long mark on his arm and his teacher decided it was a burn. She called Child Protective Services and that very night the police arrested my father's father, and that was when my father and Uncle Weldon went into foster care. We were always placed together with the same family, Uncle Weldon told me once. We weren't split up, but we never stayed with any family for very long. My father and Uncle Weldon lived with 7 foster families before my father turned 18. They lived in 5 different towns. They had a total of 32 foster brothers and sisters. They went to 9 different schools. The longest they stayed with any family was 21 months. The shortest they stayed with any family was 78 days. One night last year when my father and I were eating supper at 6:17 p.m., I said to him, "Did you have a favorite?" "A favorite what?" asked my father. "A favorite foster mother." "Yes, I did," said my father. "Her name was Hannah Pedersen." "That is very interesting," I told him, recalling Mrs. Liebler's conversational tips, because Hannah is a kind of word called a palindrome. That means you can spell it the same way whether you start at the beginning or the end. My name is not a palindrome because if you spell it backwards it's ESOR, not ROSE. But it does have a homonym. My father said, "Don't get started on homonyms, Rose." So I said, "Did you have any favorite foster brothers or sisters?" "Yes," said my father after a moment. "How interesting," I replied. "Did any of their names have homonyms?" 5. When we got rain. Now I will tell you about when we got rain. On the Friday before Thanksgiving last year, I was waiting for my father to come home from the Luck of the Irish. I knew he was at the Luck of the Irish because it was 7:49 p.m., which meant that the JR garage had been closed for 2 hours and 49 minutes. I had made hamburgers that night and I had already eaten mine because I don't like to eat dinner after 6:45 p.m. What was for dessert was popsicles, and I had also already eaten my popsicle, which was a Highcrest brand orange burst. I was studying my list of homonyms when I saw headlights circle around the kitchen and I heard a car pull into our driveway. I decided that it was my father's car. Next I heard a door slam. Then I heard another door slam and I decided that my father had brought Sam Diamond home with him. Sam Diamond is a man who drinks at the Luck of the Irish with my father and sometimes comes here to sleep on our living room couch. After a few seconds I heard footsteps on the front porch, and then I heard a sound like a whine, which was not a sound I had ever heard Sam Diamond make. I sat at the table and stared at the door. My father appeared in the porch window. "Rose, for Lord's sake, get up off your butt and come help me," he yelled. I didn't want to help my father with Sam Diamond. But when I opened the front door and looked out through the screen at the rainy night, I saw that my father was standing on the porch holding a thick rope in his left hand and that at the other end of the rope was a dog. The passenger in the car had been the dog, not Sam Diamond. The rope was tied around the dog's neck. The dog was very wet. "Where did you find a dog?" I asked my father. "Behind the Luck of the Irish." "Could you bring a towel out here so I can dry her off?" "The dog is a she?" I asked. "Yes." The towel. This was my father's way of reminding me to get the towel to dry off the wet dog. "And don't bring a white towel," my father called after me. "She's muddy." I brought a green towel to the porch and watched through the screen door while my father wiped the dog's feet and back. "She's for you," he said to me. "You can keep her." "She isn't wearing a collar," I replied. "That's why she's yours. She's a stray." "But shouldn't we look for her owners?" I asked. "They might want her back. If they didn't care enough to get her a collar, then they don't deserve her," said my father. "Besides, how would we find her owners? She doesn't have a collar, so she doesn't have any tags. Is she a gift?" I wanted to know. "What?" said my father. He stopped wiping the dog for a moment. "Yes, she's a gift, Rose. She's my gift to you." My father had not given me many gifts. The dog stood patiently while my father wiped her fur. She lifted her front feet one at a time when he held out the towel. Then she gazed at me and lifted her eyebrows up and down. She panted, and when she panted she stretched her lips wide so that she looked like she was smiling. "All right," my father said to the dog. "You're dry enough to go inside." He held the door open and the dog walked into the living room, which is really just part of the kitchen, and she leaned against my legs. I stared down at her. She stared up at me. "You can pet her," said my father. "That's what normal people do with dogs." So I petted her and she closed her eyes and pressed in closer. "What are you going to name her?" asked my father. "I will name her Rain," I replied. "You found her in the rain, and rain has two homonyms, rain and rain, so it's a special word." "That's great, Rose. And what about, thank you?" "Thank you." That night Rain slept in bed with me. She has slept with me every night since then. 6. Who I wait for. Uncle Weldon drives me to and from school every day. He does this because I'm no longer allowed to ride the bus, and when my father heard about that he announced that he couldn't drive me himself. He said, "Rose, what did you go and get yourself kicked off the bus for? How am I supposed to drive you to school in the morning and get to the garage at the same time? And how am I supposed to pick you up in the middle of the afternoon while I'm working?" There are a lot of days when there's no work for my father at the JR garage, but on those days he likes to sleep late and then go to the Luck of the Irish. Uncle Weldon said, I could drive Rose to school. Uncle Weldon works at a construction company. He has what my father calls a wuss job and what Uncle Weldon calls a desk job. He doesn't do construction. He sits at a computer. His job starts at 9 a.m., so he could easily drop me off at my school, which starts at 8:42 a.m. before going on to his company, which is called Jeans Construction, Inc. He said he would ask his boss if he could work through his lunch break so that he could pick me up at 2:42 p.m. and run me home every afternoon. When Uncle Weldon mentioned that he could drive me to school, he didn't look directly at my father. He and my father and Rain and I were sitting on the front porch, and Uncle Weldon stared out at Hud Road while he spoke. I waited for my father to say, "I can take care of this myself." But instead he lit a cigarette and stared at Hud Road too. So then I joined them in looking at the road while I said to my father, Did your father drive you to school? He didn't have to. I didn't get kicked off the bus. Why are you asking about my father? I was asking because my father always says that he's not going to be the kind of father that his father was. He says he's going to raise me up by himself if it kills him. This is why he doesn't accept much help from Uncle Weldon. And this was why Uncle Weldon asked his question so carefully. When my father thinks Uncle Weldon is interfering in my raising, he threatens to keep us apart, which would make my uncle and me feel very sad. I don't know, I said. Rain was lying next to me on the old couch that my father had put out on the porch. She rolled over on her back and rested her head in my lap. You asked me a question, but you don't know why you asked it, said my father. Yes. What about it? Uncle Weldon wanted to know. Could I drive her? It would solve the problem. It wouldn't mean you're a bad father, I said. Uncle Weldon shifted his gaze from Hud Road to me, and his eyes opened wide. That is certainly not what I meant. Well, anyway, I don't see another way around it, replied my father. And that is how Uncle Weldon started driving me to and from Hatford Elementary. Every morning, Rain and I wait on the front porch for my uncle to come along Hud Road in his black Chevrolet Montana. When I see the truck, I kiss Rain on her head and put her inside the house. Then I climb up beside my uncle and tell him if I've thought of any new homonyms since the day before. If I have, Uncle Weldon says, that's great. Then we try to think of other new homonyms that sound like the new pair, the way I did with choose and bruise. After we discuss homonyms, we look out the windows for a while, and then Uncle Weldon will say, everything all right with your father and Rain? The least complicated answer is yes. I don't say more unless I have to. Sometimes Uncle Weldon will say, would you like to go to a movie with me this weekend, Rose? Or maybe, should we take Rain on a hike on Saturday? Then we have to think about how to ask my father for permission. Finally, we drive up in front of Hatford Elementary. Uncle Weldon and I always cross our fingers and touch our hearts before I slide out of the truck. At the end of the day, I wait for my uncle again. I stand by the front door of the school and watch the kids I used to ride the bus with as they line up for bus 7. I step away from Monty Soderman, who is missing one fingernail, and who wears very heavy boots that hurt a lot when he steps on my toes. I wait, and hum and stand by myself and stare, straight, ahead so that I can see Uncle Weldon the moment he turns onto School Lane. Then I run to his truck and he smiles as he leans across the seat to open the door for me. Sometimes we have a conversation like this. Uncle Weldon, how was school? Rose Howard, it was just like yesterday. Uncle Weldon, exactly like yesterday. Rose Howard, no, that would be impossible. Uncle Weldon, because today has a different date from yesterday. Rose Howard, and because the moon and stars are in different positions than yesterday. Uncle Weldon, what's the most interesting thing you learned today? Rose Howard, that if you assign numbers to the letters in Weldon, like 23 for W because it's the 23rd letter in the alphabet, and 5 for E, and 12 for L, and 4 for D, and 15 for O, and 14 for N, the numbers add up to 73. Guess what 73 is? Uncle Weldon, a prime number. Rose Howard, yes, and that is as special as a homonym. My father's name is a prime number too. Wesley comes out to 89. Uncle Weldon, really? Rose Howard, yes, but I don't think he'll be interested. Uncle Weldon, well, I'm glad your father and I have prime number names, since you and Rain have homonym names. Now nobody will feel left out. Rose Howard, I wonder if my father would let me come over to your house on Saturday. I could rewrite my homonyms list. It's getting crowded. Uncle Weldon, would you like me to ask him about that? Rose Howard, yes, but just ask if I can come over. Don't mention the list. Uncle Weldon, I'll do what I can. Finger crosses, heart touches, I wave goodbye to my uncle. 7. Why I don't ride the bus. I used to ride bus 7 to school. Bus 7 made 14 stops, which was good because 14 is a multiple of 7. I was the only person at my bus stop, the second stop on the route. At the next 12 stops, every kid would walk down the aisle looking for a seat and pass by the empty space next to me. Marnie Mayhew, who lives at the prime number homonym address of 11 Band Lane, would flick a spitball at me as she went by. I would stare straight ahead and let it bounce off my face onto the bus floor. Then Wilson Antonelli would come along and say, "Pick it up, retard. You're littering." At each stop our driver, whose name was Shirley Ringwood, would look at us backward in her big glaring mirror and wait until everyone was sitting down. Then she would close the door, put bus 7 in gear, and start driving again. And I would watch out my window to see who was following the rules of the road. There are lots of rules for drivers, and they're listed clearly in the New York State Driver's Manual, but many drivers don't follow them. Hey, I would shout. That man didn't use his directional before he turned the corner, Mrs. Ringwood, did you see that? He broke the law. Sometimes Mrs. Ringwood would answer me, sometimes she just kept her eyes on the road ahead. It depended on how close to her I was sitting. Rainy days were difficult. The rule is that if your windshield wipers are on, then your headlights must be on too. Mrs. Ringwood, I just saw 3 cars with their wipers on and their headlights off, I would cry. Marnie would start to giggle and Wilson would lean over his seat and hold out his cell phone and say, "Why don't you report that to the police, retard? They're supposed to follow the rules, they aren't following the rules." One day I sat down in the first row of seats so I could watch Mrs. Ringwood's driving. She slowed bus 7 as we approached the intersection of Sandy Road and Route 9W. Then we rolled slowly by the stop sign. "Mrs. Ringwood, you didn't come to a complete stop," I shouted. "Mrs. Ringwood, that's against the law. It says in the manual that you must come to a complete stop." A complete stop. Mrs. Ringwood turned onto Route 9W. "Let it go, Rose." "Mrs. Ringwood, are your headlights on?" A spitball hit me on the back of my neck. "Hey, that driver wasn't wearing his seatbelt. Did you see that, Mrs. Ringwood?" We reached School Lane. Ahead was Hatford Elementary. Mrs. Ringwood turned the wheel to the right and we started to swing into our bus lane. "Stop," I shouted. "Mrs. Ringwood, stop right now." Mrs. Ringwood slammed on the brakes. "What's the matter?" she cried. She stood up to look out her window. Behind me, all the kids crowded to the other windows to see what had happened. Traffic came to a halt. "You didn't use your directional," I said. "That's against the rules." Mrs. Ringwood sat down again. She leaned her forehead on the steering wheel. Then she turned around and said to me, "Are you freaking kidding?" After she parked bus 7, she went into Hatford Elementary and spoke with the principal. That's why I don't ride the bus anymore. 8. In my classroom. My classroom faces southeast and has windows along one side and 21 desks for students, plus Mrs. Cushell's desk, plus Mrs. Liebler's chair, which sits next to my desk and blocks the aisle. There are 11 girls and 10 boys in my class. There are 2 gerbils in my class. Our classroom rules are written on a sheet of oak tag, which is posted next to the door of our room. Mrs. Cushell smells of apples and has a husband and a girl who is 6 and has the prime number name of Edie, 23. Mrs. Cushell knew last spring that she was going to get me as her student and she scheduled a conference with my father who said, "I promise Rose won't be any trouble." When Mrs. Cushell asked what my father does about my tantrums at home, he said, "Rose doesn't have any tantrums at home, not while I'm around. She knows better." And then he said, "Ha ha. Just kidding. I know this because I was sitting in the waiting room outside the school psychologist's office and I could hear every word of the conference. I hear lots of things I'm not supposed to hear, and lots of things nobody else is able to hear, because my hearing is very acute, which is a part of my diagnosis of high-functioning autism. The clicks our refrigerator makes bother me, and so does the humming sound that comes from Mrs. Cushell's laptop computer. One day in school I put my hands over my ears and said, "I can't concentrate, please turn that thing off." "What thing?" asked Mrs. Liebler. "I want Mrs. Cushell to turn off her computer," I said clearly, in the way Mrs. Liebler has taught me. "Tell me clearly what you want, Rose," Mrs. Liebler says when I'm out of control. "Why do you want her to turn it off?" asked 4 feet 10 inches Josh Bartle, who sits in front of me. "Because of the humming, I don't hear any humming," said Josh. "Rose, settle down," said Mrs. Liebler. "I hear clicks and humming and whispers. And conversations in the psychologist's office when the door is almost closed. Mrs. Cushell has been my teacher for 25 school days now. On the afternoon of day 25 she announces to our class, 'I have an assignment that will be fun for you. You're going to write a composition about a pet.' 'I don't have a pet,' says Flo, whose name is easy to remember because of the homonyms Flo and Flo. Mrs. Cushell smiles, which is her way of saying that she doesn't mind that Flo interrupted her. 'That isn't a problem,' she replies, 'because you may write about any pet at all. If you don't have your own pet, you may write about an imaginary one or someone else's pet.' Mrs. Cushell passes out paper and I find my pencil and stare at the door for a while. 'Rose,' says Mrs. Liebler. I'm thinking, I say, without looking at her. I start writing about rain. I try to remember what Mrs. Cushel has said about themes, and what Mrs. Liebler has said about not working homonyms into every theme. Time's up, Mrs. Cushel says after 21.5 minutes. Who would like to read aloud to the class? It doesn't matter if your composition is finished. Just read what you have so far. You can finish your work at home tonight. 3 girls and 2 boys raise their hands. Mrs. Cushel calls on Flo, who reads about a pet she has made up in her head, called a chickapoo, which is a cross between a chicken and a poodle. Flo says her chickapoo doesn't cluck or bark, it clarks. Everyone laughs, while I think about the clarking chickapoo just long enough to figure out that chickapoo is not a prime number word, but a word that is 81, which means it's divisible by 3, so it's not as good as a prime number, although it's interesting. The next person to read is Josh Bartle, who has written about his 4 neon tetra fish. My mom picked out the first fish for my sister and I last summer, he says. I interrupt him right there. Mrs. Cushel, I cry. Mrs. Cushel, Josh broke a rule. He wrote, for my sister and I, and that's not right. Rose, what have we said about interrupting? But he was supposed to write, for my sister and me. Me, I, isn't always correct. Rose, that's a comment you might make later, when Josh has finished reading, says Mrs. Cushel. And, Mrs. Liebler says quietly to me as Josh continues with his composition, you might think about telling him something positive first, and then pointing out his mistake. I put my head down on my desk. Rose, Mrs. Liebler whispers. I don't raise my head. He didn't pay attention to the rules, I can feel tears in my eyes. Rose, Mrs. Cushel clearly told us about that rule on September 17th, I say loudly into my arms. Do you need to step into the hall? I stand up suddenly and my chair shoots backward and slams into Morgan's desk. Hey, she cries. I hit the right side of my head with the heel of my hand. 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Josh is still reading about his neon tetra fish, but most of the class is looking at me now. Come on, says Mrs. Liebler, and she steers me to the door and into the hall. You need to settle down. I imagine that my father will read about this in Friday's report. 9. Mrs. Liebler, who sits next to me. Mrs. Liebler is almost always by my side. She sits next to me in Mrs. Cushel's class, and she walks with me to the girls' room and the playground. I'm the only student in 5th grade at Hatford Elementary with an aide. This leads me to believe that most 5th graders don't need aides. Even so, twice I've heard kids in my class say to Mrs. Cushel, it isn't fair that Rose gets so much special attention. The first person to say that was Lenora Tedesco. The second person was Josh Bartle. Mrs. Liebler sits with me in the cafeteria too, and we eat our lunches together. I buy my lunch, the same lunch every day, an apple and a tuna sandwich and milk. Mrs. Liebler brings her lunch, which is not the same lunch every day. Sometimes she brings a sandwich, sometimes leftovers like noodles, Mrs. Liebler calls them pasta, or a chicken leg or salmon or rice and vegetables. Mrs. Liebler always says, would you like a taste, Rose? And I always say no because I don't want to vary my lunch. On Mondays Mrs. Liebler chooses 2 kids from our class to be my lunchroom buddies for the week. She keeps a list of the buddies so that everyone gets the same number of turns. Usually when she announces the buddies no one says anything. In the cafeteria Mrs. Liebler follows me through the lunch line. When I have my apple and sandwich and milk we sit at a table, and pretty soon the lunchroom buddies finish getting their own lunches by themselves, and then they sit down with us. Today is Monday and my new buddies are Flo and Anders, one name that's divisible by 3, Flo, 33, and one prime number name, Anders, 61. Mrs. Liebler nods at me. Rose. I finish chewing a bite of apple and say, I live in a house that faces northeast. Which direction do your houses face? Mrs. Liebler is raising her eyebrows at me and I remember that I'm supposed to look at Flo and Anders when I talk to them. So I lean across the table and stare into their eyes and say again, which direction do your houses face? Flo shrugs her shoulders and leans away from me. I don't know. She sees that Mrs. Liebler is busy opening her container of pasta, and she turns to Anders and rolls her eyes at him. Anders rolls his eyes back at Flo and says, I don't know either. I think for a moment. Then I say to Anders, you don't know which direction your house faces or you don't know which direction Flo's house faces. He stiffens his lips and I think maybe he's trying not to laugh. He says, I don't know which direction anything faces. Mrs. Liebler spills some of the pasta on her shirt, and she stands up suddenly and says, "Excuse me, I'll be right back." "Why do you care which direction things face?" Flo asks as soon as we're alone. Mrs. Liebler has not prepared me for this question, so I say, you, and you, are homonyms. "Wow, that is fascinating," replies Anders. Flo starts to giggle. "Please tell us more about homonyms." I set down my apple. I do not include abbreviated words on my list, I inform them. "Do you think incorporated is actually a homonym for ink?" "Of course not," says Flo. Mrs. Liebler returns to the table with a handful of napkins. Mrs. Liebler, I say. I'm telling Flo and Anders about the homonym abbreviation rule. Mrs. Liebler looks at me over the top of her glasses and says, "Let's steer the conversation in a different direction. Away from homonyms. Think about some of." I don't want Mrs. Liebler to say anything about conversation starters in front of my lunchroom buddies. I feel a little bit like crying, but I don't, and I don't bang myself in the head either. Instead I say, "I have a dog named Rain." I'm about to ask, "Do you have any pets?" when I remember our compositions and Flo's chickapoo. "Rain eats my pet dog food," I continue. "What does your Clarking chickapoo eat, Flo?" Flo starts to giggle again, but this time it's a true laugh. "You remembered," she exclaims. She thinks for a moment and finally she says, "Well, a Clarking chickapoo eats chog food." "Chog food?" exclaims Anders. "Oh," I say. "Chog, for, chicken, and dog." Anders starts to laugh, and then Mrs. Liebler laughs too, and now instead of feeling sad, I'm happy about Mrs. Liebler and her conversation starters. Just like my father is happy that Uncle Weldon can take me to school, but he was mad that Uncle Weldon thought up the solution in the first place. 10 Anders isn't following the rules. On day 32 with Mrs. Kuschel, I finish 2 math worksheets without saying a word about the buzzing I can hear, which is Mrs. Liebler's cell phone in her purse. When I solve the last problem I turn to Mrs. Liebler and she says, "Excellent, Rose. You focused very well today." I glance at the clock and see that there are 4 minutes left in math period. "May I play with the pizza game?" I ask. Mrs. Liebler looks at the shelf where the math games are stored. "Someone else is playing with it," she says. "It isn't on the shelf. What would you like to do instead?" "Nothing. I'll wait for the pizza game." I always play with the pizza game if I have spare time during math, which Mrs. Liebler knows. I wait patiently at my desk for a few moments. Then I stand up and look around the room for the game. "There it is," I cry. "Mrs. Liebler, it's on Anders's desk and he isn't playing with it. He's talking to Martin." "Calm down," says Mrs. Liebler. "Why don't you ask Anders if you can have a turn now? He was supposed to put it back on the shelf if he wasn't using it." I point to Mrs. Kuschel's rules, the ones posted by the door. "Look, rule number 6. All games, supplies, art materials, and books must be returned to their proper places when not in use." "He broke the rule." "I don't think he broke it on purpose," says Mrs. Liebler. "He should have a consequence," I say. "Mrs. Kuschel will talk to him about that later. Anders is watching me now. So is most of the class. He holds the pizza game out to me. I don't take it. "It isn't fair," I say to Mrs. Liebler. "I was waiting for the game and now math is over." "I'm sorry, Rose," says Anders. I pick up my worksheets and dig my nails into them. "Rose, please give those to me," says Mrs. Liebler. I start to cry. I was waiting patiently. "I know, but don't ruin your worksheets. Give them to me and then we'll go into the hall so you can calm down." Mrs. Liebler places the worksheets on Mrs. Kuschel's desk. Then she leads me to the hallway. As we go out the door I jab my finger at the list of rules. Number 6, I cry. 11. When Rain went to school. On school day 33 Uncle Weldon pulls his black Chevrolet Montana into our driveway at 8:16 a.m. He sees Rain and me sitting on the porch and he waves to us by sticking his left hand out the window. Then he sticks his head out the window. "Rose," he calls. "Bring Rain. I don't have to go into work today. Rain can spend the day with me." This is not part of the routine. I stand on the porch for a moment and look at Rain. Rain. "Come on," my uncle calls. "Rain and I will have fun together. And she won't be lonely." "Okay." I lock the door behind me since my father has already left for the garage, and I lead Rain to the truck. Rain sits between Uncle Weldon and me while we ride to Hatford Elementary. "Is build and build on your homonyms list?" asks Uncle Weldon as we drive past the coffee cup on Route 28. "I thought of that one last night." "Yes," I say. "I really like that pair." Rain puts one of her paws in my lap and I stroke her toes. What are you and Rain going to do today? She can run around the yard while I stack firewood. Then maybe we'll go for a walk. Okay, even though this is not the routine, I'm glad Rain will have a nice time with Uncle Weldon. We reach school lane and my uncle says, I hope you have a good day, Rose. Rain and I will see you at 2:42. He turns into the drop-off lane and reaches across my lap to open the door. Bye, I say. Before I hop out, Uncle Weldon and I touch our hearts with our crossed fingers. I run to Mrs. Liebler, who is waiting for me at the front door. Good morning, Rose, she says. We hurry along side by side through the corridors to Mrs. Cushell's room. I have already hung up my sweater and am taking my homework out of my backpack when Flo says, Hey, a dog. Flo is pointing to the doorway, so I turn around and look at the doorway. There's Rain, standing under the list of class rules. Rain, I exclaim. What are you doing here? Is that your dog? Asks Anders. Rain sees me and trots across the room to my desk. Yes, I say. Is that the dog from your composition? Asks Josh Bartle. Yes, I say. What's she doing here? Flo wants to know. I shake my head. I guess she followed me. Rain must have jumped out of the truck before Uncle Weldon could close the door. But how did she know where you were? You'd been here for, 2 minutes before she found our room, points out a girl named Parvani. She followed me with her nose, I tell her. I sit on the floor and put my arms around Rain. She licks my forehead and then she sits down too. She's so cute, cries Flo. She joins us on the floor. Can I pat her? Yes. Flo runs her hand down Rain's back, and Rain makes her smiling face. How old is she? Asks Josh. He sits down with us, which makes 3 humans and 1 dog sitting on the floor of Mrs. Cushell's room. I'm not sure. My father found her one night in the rain. We don't know how old she was then. So she's a rescue dog? Asks Anders. Before I can answer him, Parvani says, How did she follow you with her nose? She has a very sharp sense of smell. All dogs do. But I think Rain is special. Everyone is crowded around us now, even Mrs. Liebler and Mrs. Cushell. 5 people are patting Rain at once. This is when I hear Uncle Weldon say, Excuse me, and then, oh, thank goodness. Rain, there you are, my uncle is at the door of our classroom. She found me, I say. Did she ever? She wanted to follow you after you got out of the truck. I held her back, but when I finally let go of her to close the door, she jumped out. Uncle Weldon turns to Mrs. Cushell. Sorry about this, he says. My fault. I was the one who wanted to bring Rain along this morning. Mrs. Cushell is smiling. No harm done. Rain has a smart nose, says Flo, and she strokes Rain's nose. You're so lucky, Rose, says Parvani. Mrs. Cushell lets everyone visit with Rain for 3.5 more minutes before she says, All right, class. It's time to get to work. Say goodbye to Rain. Uncle Weldon has a leash in his pocket and he clips it to Rain's collar before he leads her out into the hall. Goodbye, Rain, call my classmates. In the cafeteria that day, my lunchroom buddies and I have a lot to talk about. 12. Some more about homonyms. Here are some more good homonyms. Grown, find, wrapped, patience. Patience. One thing about the last pair of homonyms that is both interesting and boring is that you can use the NTS pattern to find other homonyms. For instance, independence, presence, innocence. It's interesting because the pattern makes homonyms seem even more worthwhile, but it's boring because the pattern also makes finding new homonym pairs too easy. But I still like all homonyms. On school day 34, Josh Bartle says to me, Rose, how come you go to the trouble of thinking up homonyms by yourself? You know, you can find hundreds of them by looking at Janice Joyner's list of homonyms. All you have to do is Google homonyms, and you'll get to the list. It goes on forever. I think about this. There are 2 problems with what Josh has said. 1. My father and I didn't have a computer before, when Josh suggested that I keep my list on a computer, and we still don't have one. 2. Another of my homonym rules is that I have to think of the homonyms myself. What is the point of looking at someone else's list and copying it? My list is original, but what I say to Josh, as I stare into his eyes, is, I'm glad you're interested in homonyms. 13. At the end of the day, the routine for after school is that Uncle Weldon picks me up at 2:42 p.m. and drops me off at my house between 2:58 and 3:01. Rain always greets me by jumping up and down when I open the door, licking my hands and face, and sometimes barking. Usually after that, we sit on the porch for a while. But if it's rainy or chilly, then we do not sit on the porch. At the end of school day 35, we do not sit on the porch. It's foggy and cool, so we take a walk that lasts only 6.5 minutes. Rain pulls at her leash when I try to turn her around, and I know she would like a longer walk, but it's too damp and muddy for that. I'm going to look through the box, I say as Rain reluctantly follows me back to our yard. On a shelf in the coat closet is a box, a hat box. The top and bottom are held together by a white satin braid. The braid is fraying, which leads me to believe that the box and the braid are old. Also, the box used to be blue, but over the years the blue has faded to a lighter and lighter shade. Now it's pale gray. Inside the box are things that belonged to my mother, before she left. My father doesn't care if I look through the things, so I look through them approximately every 4 months, which is 3 times a year. 4 times 3 equals 12, I drag a chair to the closet, reach up high for the box, and lift it down carefully. I set it on the kitchen table. Before I open the box, I study the outside of it to see if I can find any clues to my mother. But there's nothing. The box always looks the same, except that the color gets lighter and the braid gets fuzzier. I wish my mother had written something on the box, something like "These things are important to me," or "Gifts for Rose," or even just "Treasures." But there are no words or clues of any sort. I don't even know if the box belonged to my mother or if it's just some box my father found for storing her things. My father won't talk about the box or its contents anymore. I slide the braid aside, remove the top of the box, and look in at the familiar items. One by one, I take them out. I set them on the table in a row from left to right. I always start with the necklace that has a silver bird's nest hanging from it. Inside the nest are 3 pearls, that are fake and are supposed to be birds' eggs. What does the necklace say about my mother? Maybe that she's a person who likes birds or birds' nests or birds' eggs. Next, I take out the seashell that looks like a tan cone and is called an auger. My mother must like augers too. She likes birds, birds' nests, birds' eggs, and augers. The third item I take out is a photo of a black cat. Written on the back of the photo is midnight. I don't remember having a cat, or any pet before my father brought Rain home. I study the cat some more. My mother likes birds, birds' nests, birds' eggs, augers, photos, and black cats named Midnight. After the photo, I examine 2 pins. The first is a little silver R for Rose. I wonder why my mother didn't take that with her. But maybe she didn't want to be reminded of me. After all, she left my father and me, so why would she want to think about us? The second pin is the kind called a hat pin. I know these things about the pins because when I was very small, sometimes my father would look through the box with me and tell me about the items in it. He won't do that now, but he used to, and that is how I know that the R stands for Rose and that the second pin is a hat pin. It looks like a very big needle, and attached to the end, where the head of a pin should be, is a tiny clock. The clock doesn't work, the hands are just painted on. They point to 7:15. Once I asked my father if there was any reason the clock reads 7:15. He said, no. I wonder if my mother likes homonyms. I wonder if she likes prime numbers or rules or words. I wonder if she left because I like those things. The last items in the hat box are a nickel with a buffalo on it, a tiny square of newspaper announcing that Elizabeth Parsons wed Wesley Howard in the First Presbyterian Church in Hatford, the hospital bracelet I wore when I was born, and a scarf with a picture of a rose on it. I wish I knew more about my mother. I know what she looks like. There are 2 pictures of her on the table by the couch. But I wish I knew something else besides the fact that she likes birds, birds' nests, birds' eggs, augers, photos, black cats named Midnight, pins, the letter R, clocks, 7:15, nickels, buffaloes, her wedding announcement, my hospital bracelet, scarves, and roses. I look at the clock on the kitchen wall. I have 3 worksheets for homework tonight. It's time to start them and then start dinner. I put my mother's things back into the box in reverse order, starting with the scarf and ending with the necklace, and then I put the box back on the closet shelf. It's later, when I'm adding Rain's my pet dry food to her my pet wet food, that I turn on the radio and hear the weather forecaster say, approaching storm. Hurricane Susan is expected to make landfall in 3 days, and will be of epic proportions, a superstorm that could become the storm of the century. Part 2. The part about the hurricane. 14. The storm on the Weather Channel. On the day I hear about Hurricane Susan, my father comes home from work at 5:43, which is an interesting time because the numbers are in reverse numerical order. Also, it's a good time because it means my father probably had only one drink at the Luck of the Irish after the JR garage closed. For dinner I have fixed frozen chicken legs from a box, rice, and milk. Rain has already eaten her my pet dinner. My father and I sit down facing each other at the kitchen table. Rain squeezes herself under my chair. I look directly into my father's eyes and do not say a word about homonyms. Why are you staring at me, Rose? He asks. A superstorm named Hurricane Susan is coming, I tell him. Where did you hear this? From Weldon, from the weather forecaster on WMHT. 88.7 on your dial. My father shrugs. It will be a storm of epic proportions, I add. And what are these epic proportions? I didn't hear the details, so I reply, a superstorm that could become the storm of the century. My father shrugs again. We live inland, Rose. Well, inland. A hurricane isn't going to affect us. Hurricanes stick to the coast. Sometimes they never even get to the coast. They turn around and head back out to sea. I think for a moment. 88.7 on your dial is our local station. Yeah, our local station is talking about the superstorm. Sometimes my father grunts. It sounds like UNH. He grunts now. UNH. Then he takes a swallow of milk and says, all right. We'll look at the Weather Channel later. As soon as we've finished dinner and I've washed the dishes, I turn on the television in the living room. I tune it to the prime number channel of 83, the Weather Channel. Two people are sitting at a desk. Their names are written on the screen, Monica Findlay and Rex Caprese. Monica and Rex have serious looks on their faces. Behind them is a map of the United States, and to the right, swirling around in the Atlantic Ocean, is a big red-colored ball that is supposed to be a picture of Hurricane Susan. It takes up a lot of the ocean. Monica and Rex are shuffling through papers and talking to each other, and Rex turns around and points to the swirling red ball. Then a face pops up in a little box on the left-hand side of the screen, and now Monica and Rex are talking to a third person whose name is Hammond Griffin. Hammond Griffin is a storm expert. A second map appears on the screen, and now there's so much going on that I can't follow it all. I put my fingers over my eyes and stick my thumbs in my ears, and this is when I hear, faintly, my father come into the room and say, Rose, don't start. Just turn the TV off if it's bothering you. Then he adds, what's the matter? You turn the TV off, I tell him, without moving my hands. I hear the TV go off. Now what is the problem? I uncover my eyes and unplug my ears. There was too much on the screen. I try to think how to state my problem clearly. My father sighs. What? 3 people and 2 maps. And too much noise. I'll watch the weather later when you're asleep, my father says at last. Then he asks, were you scared about the storm or did you get confused? I wasn't scared, I say. He frowns at me and then he grunts. UNH. Look, the storm won't get this far. The weather people just like to make a big fuss so everyone will watch their show. We might get a little wind and rain. That's all. Okay, why don't you go to bed now? Because it's too early. My routine calls for walking rain in 45 minutes, then changing into my pajamas, and after that going to bed. Well, don't think about the storm. Okay, I think I'll go out for a while. Okay, 15. Where we live. While my father is back at the Luck of the Irish, I think about the superstorm named Hurricane Susan. I wonder how many miles Hatford is from the Atlantic Ocean. I need to see a map, but I don't want to turn on the Weather Channel again. I sit on the couch in our quiet house and pat rain for a while. Then I remember that there used to be a map of New England in our garage. I put on my sneakers and use a flashlight to shine my way across the yard to the square white garage. Rain comes along, walking so close to me that I can feel her shoulder against my leg. I turn on the garage light and find the map. It's on my father's workbench and is not folded up properly, the creases going in the wrong directions, which makes the map puffy, not flat. I spread it out on the workbench, fold it back up the right way, then spread it out again. I put my finger on Hatford. All of the state of Massachusetts and a little of the state of New York are between my finger and the Atlantic Ocean. Maybe my father is right. Maybe we live too far inland to be bothered by a hurricane. But why was the newscaster on WMHT warning us about the superstorm? I refold the map, making sure the creases are in the right directions, and rain, and I leave the garage and walk back to the house. I sit on the couch again. I think about Hud Road and my neighborhood. Here are some facts about where I live. 1. The buildings on Hud Road are the Luck of the Irish, the JR Garage, the house where I live with my father and Rain, and our garage. That is all. 2. Our house is on a little rise of land. The yard slopes from the house down to Hud Road, and Hud Road runs downhill to the JR garage and the Luck of the Irish at the bottom. 3. There are 8 very tall trees in our yard. 4 of them are maples, 2 are oaks, 1 is an elm, and 1 is a birch. Behind our house are woods. 4. There are a lot of small streams in our neighborhood. They do not have names. The biggest of them runs alongside Hud, in between our yard and the road. It flows underneath the little bridge at the bottom of our driveway. I have never seen more than 10.5 inches of water there. The other little streams begin farther up Hud Road and feed into the one in front of our house, which rushes down toward the bottom. These facts are not as interesting as homonyms or prime numbers. They are informative only, but you will need to understand them when you read later chapters, such as Chapter 19, Rain Doesn't Come When I Call, which takes place the day after Hurricane Susan. I finish thinking about Hud Road and our neighborhood. It's time to walk Rain. Later, when I'm in bed, listening for the sound of my father's car in the driveway, I hug Rain to me. We live inland, I say to myself. This must be good. I say it over and over. We live inland, we live inland, we live inland. 16. How to get ready for a hurricane. It's Monday when my father says the people on the Weather Channel just like to make a fuss so that everyone will watch their show. On Tuesday he frowns a little and says why can't the Weather Channel people be more specific about the path of the storm. On Wednesday he says he doesn't ever remember losing power for more than 4 days. Today is Thursday and my father is at home and out in our yard when Uncle Weldon drops me off after school. My father is checking to see if our gas cans are full. Rain is watching him from the couch on the porch. Her head is resting on her front paws, but her eyes are alert. Bye, I say to my uncle, and because I like him, I lean back into the truck before I close the door, and I look directly into his eyes. Thank you for the ride, I say clearly. Uncle Weldon smiles at me. You're welcome. I'll see you tomorrow. Finger crosses, heart touches. My uncle waves to my father through the windshield and turns the truck around. You're not at work, I say to my father. Nope, not at work. Very observant. This might be sarcasm, which is like mockery. Rain jumps off the porch to greet me and my father says, I'm going into town to get supplies. Do you and Rain want to come with me? Supplies for the superstorm known as Hurricane Susan. Yes. Do you want to come with me? He says again, and this is my reminder to answer his question. Yes, I do, I say. I sit beside my father in the cab of our truck. Rain rides in the back. We drive down Hud Road. As we pass the JR garage, my father waves to Jerry, who's one of the owners. I don't know why my father isn't working today, but I don't ask him any questions. At the bottom of Hud Road, my father turns left without using his directional. Hey, you didn't, I cry. But my father says, can it, Rose, without looking at me. We drive into Hatford and my father angles the truck into a parking place near the hardware store. The inside of the store is very crowded. So many people are shopping today that it's hard to walk down the aisles. 33. What a microchip is. It turns out that a microchip is a tiny chip, about the size of a grain of rice, that a veterinarian injects into a pet, and that contains information such as who the pet's owners are and how to contact them. We scanned Rain, for a chip when she was brought in, Mrs. Caporal tells Uncle Weldon and me. She's been talking for a long time now, explaining microchip technology, and I'm trying hard not to interrupt again, but finally I can't help it. We didn't have Rain microchipped, I burst out. We've never even taken her to the vet. But she does have a microchip, says Mrs. Caporal. Are you sure? I'm getting a strange feeling in my stomach. Of course. We scanned it, and that's how we know her name is Olivia. Mrs. Caporal is frowning now. She sits in one of the chairs and opens a folder she's been carrying. Then she turns to Uncle Weldon. So you aren't Jason Henderson? From Gloverstown? Uncle Weldon shakes his head. We've been trying to contact the Hendersons, but we haven't had any luck, says Mrs. Caporal. That's why we were so pleased when you called yesterday, Rose, even though you hung up before we could get your number. Our phones have been misbehaving ever since the storm, she adds, and smiles at me. We thought you were one of the Hendersons. We assumed they'd had to move because of Susan. Gloverstown got hit badly and we just get a fast busy signal whenever we call the Hendersons' home number. And they didn't include a cell number on their contact information, so. She spreads her hands. I slump onto the floor with Rain again. I put my arms around her and feel her fur against my neck. She's so soft that I think maybe she's been given a bath recently. I rest my cheek next to her face. Who are you, Rain? I whisper. 34. What Mrs. Caporal says. Mrs. Caporal and Uncle Weldon continue their conversation. I sit on the floor and think about Rain and my father. I remember the night my father brought Rain home. I wonder if my father didn't know about microchips or if he just didn't want to look for Rain's owners. I think of my father letting Rain outside during a superstorm without her collar. I realize that my father hasn't helped me one bit in my search for Rain. I turn around and say to Mrs. Caporal, my father found Rain in the rain. That's why I named her Rain. Also, it's a homonym. Mrs. Caporal looks puzzled. Rain was all by herself with no collar, I continue. Did you try to look for her owners? Mrs. Caporal asks. I shake my head. My father said we couldn't look because she didn't have any identification. Also, he said if she had owners they must not have cared very much about her. I pause and then say in a smaller voice, but they cared enough to have her microchipped. Mrs. Caporal looks at me and says gently, pets can get separated from their owners for all kinds of reasons. Getting lost or separated doesn't mean the owners are irresponsible. I wonder if Mrs. Caporal is talking about the Hendersons or about my father and me. I nod. For some reason, I feel like crying again, so I say, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. But I say it in my head so that I'm the only one who hears it. I see Uncle Weldon look from Rain and me to Mrs. Caporal. What happens now? He asks. Do we leave Rain here? No, I cry. No, 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 no. I jump to my feet. Rain stands up too, looking nervous. She leans against my legs and nuzzles my hand with her nose. Mrs. Caporal lets out a breath of air that puffs her hair away from her forehead. This is the first time I've run into this situation, she admits. Let me talk to one of my co-workers. She leaves the waiting room. Uncle Weldon and I sit in the chairs. Rain jumps up and settles herself with her head in my lap and her rear in Uncle Weldon's lap. I say to my uncle, I'd feel better if Olivia was a homonym name, but it isn't. Uncle Weldon gives me a sad smile. At last Mrs. Caporal returns. She sits next to Uncle Weldon and says, see if you think this is fair, considering that we've been trying to reach the Hendersons and haven't had any luck, and considering that Rain has been living with Rose for a year and clearly loves her, and I love Rain, I say. And you love Rain, Mrs. Caporal continues, we've decided that she should go home with you, at least temporarily. It only seems fair, and she'll certainly be happier living with you than living here at the shelter. Thank you, I cry. However, Mrs. Caporal goes on, we will continue to search for the Hendersons. We're busier than usual just now, because of the storm, but we will search. And if we reach them, or if they contact us, and they want Rain back, well then. She spreads her hands again. Rain is their dog after all. I mean, she was. Originally. So, please fill out this form with your information and we'll keep it on file. She starts to hand the form to me, then looks at Uncle Weldon. I'll fill it out, he says. I'll put down my information as well as Rose's and her father's. 5 minutes later Uncle Weldon and I are walking out of Happy Tales with Rain between us. 4. The hard part. 35. The thing I have to do. When Uncle Weldon and I park on Hud Road by the plank bridge over the stream and climb out of the truck with Rain, my father, who is working in the yard, gets a look on his face that is most likely surprise. His eyes grow big and at first he doesn't say anything. Uncle Weldon takes my hand and we start across the bridge, Rain ahead of us. She picks her way slowly because she isn't used to balancing on the planks. When she reaches our yard she catches sight of my father, standing among lots of tools and boards. She gives a little wag of her tail. Finally my father speaks. He says, well, I'll be. I'm not sure what that means. I say, we found Rain. Yes, I see that. Do you feel happy? I ask my father. He kneels down as Rain trots closer to him. I'm just surprised, that's all. I can't believe you found her. So I was right about feeling surprised. I had a plan, I remind him. It was a good plan. I guess so, says my father, who is patting Rain. Except, says Uncle Weldon from behind me, there's an issue. My father looks up sharply, and then he gets to his feet. An issue? Uncle Weldon explains about the Hendersons and the microchip. I look closely at my father when Uncle Weldon says microchip. My father is frowning. Rain had identification after all, I point out. Now my father looks sharply at me. What are you saying? I think for a moment. I said that Rain had identification after all. My father shakes his head. Look, you got your dog back, Rose. Just let it be. On the ride home from Happy Tales, Rain sat in my lap. She barely moved, and she kept her face pressed next to my cheek so that I could feel her whiskers and little puffs of air as she breathed. Every now and then she turned and licked my nose. I look around the yard. My father and I have cleaned it up pretty well. My father is working on the permanent bridge, and as long as we have the temporary one, we aren't stranded on our property anymore. Our power and phones are back, and school has started again. Most important of all, Rain is home. I know I should feel happiness. If Parvani's mother somehow got all her artwork back safe and sound, she would feel happiness. But I don't feel happiness. Instead, I feel that something is wrong. I thank Uncle Weldon for helping me, and Rain and I go into the house. Rain sniffs at everything on the way: twigs, logs, weeds, the porch steps, the couch on the porch. Then she sniffs her way through the house and into my room, where she jumps on the bed and looks at me. I sit next to her and wrap my arms around her neck. Then, because something still feels wrong, I start to cry. I cry into Rain's fur and she sits there patiently, occasionally turning to lick my cheeks, until I get a Kleenex and blow my nose and make the tears stop. I know what is wrong. It's what my father said a few minutes ago. You got your dog back, Rose. Your dog back. Your dog back, Rose. But Rain isn't my dog. Rain is the Hendersons' dog. She belongs to them. Or she used to. And they cared enough about her to have her microchipped. I don't know how she got separated from them, but she did, and they probably want her back. Especially now. Especially if they've lost their home in the storm and are feeling very, very sad. I know what I have to do. I don't want to do it, but rules are rules, and I must follow them. Somewhere a family named Henderson is missing Rain. If they miss her as much as I missed her when she was lost, then they want her badly. And she belongs to them. I don't know when the shelter will start their search for the Hendersons, but I need to start mine now. I have to find the Hendersons and give Rain back. Rain lets out a sigh and flops on my bed. I lie down beside her. I wonder if she knows what I'm thinking. I recall the information on Rain's microchip form. Mrs. Caporal didn't give the information to Uncle Weldon, but I peeked at the form and saw the Hendersons' phone number and address and memorized them. I know where they live, or where they used to live. The information will help in my new search. I do some mental calculations. The name Henderson comes out to 102, which is clearly not a prime number. Olivia is not a prime number name either. I don't know if this means anything. 36 million rupees. Kushal's helpful suggestions ever since the storm. Mrs. Kushal has started off each morning in class by asking if anyone has anything they'd like to share. For 15 minutes, we raise our hands and tell our classmates about things that are troubling us, or things that are getting better. The Monday after Uncle Weldon and I bring Rain home, I say to my classmates, Rain is back. We found her at the Happy Tales animal shelter in Elmira, New York. Everyone has questions. Is she okay? Did she remember you? Was she happy to see you? How did she get all the way to Elmira? Why didn't she follow her nose back to your house? I answer the questions as well as I can. I do not mention the Hendersons or the microchip. I am privately working on my new plan. I called the Hendersons' phone number, but just like Mrs. Caporal said, all I got was a strange busy signal. So I'm not sure how to look for the Hendersons. But I know someone I can ask for advice. One morning Uncle Weldon agrees to take me to school 10 minutes earlier than usual. I arrive before Mrs. Liebler does, and so I walk to my classroom by myself. I find Mrs. Kushal sitting at her desk. No one else is in the room. Mrs. Kushal, I say. She jumps a little. Rose, you're here early. I stare at her. I have a question. Mrs. Kushal puts her pen down and looks at me very seriously. Yes. How would someone who found a lost dog look for the owners of the dog? Well, the person could place an ad in the newspaper, Mrs. Kushal replies, and also check the paper for ads about lost dogs. He could put up posters with a picture of the dog and information about when and where the dog was found. Also, he could call vets and shelters and put up posts on websites for lost pets. Him, I say. Mrs. Kushal frowns at me. Did you find a lost dog, Rose? I nod my head. Yes. 37 where Rain used to live. Secretly, at times when my father is not in the house, I phone the Hendersons' number. Each time I get the fast busy signal. It's not the same kind of busy signal I get when I call Uncle Weldon and he's on the phone. Most people have call waiting now, and you don't get a busy signal at all when you dial them. But maybe the Hendersons are like Uncle Weldon and don't have call waiting. Still, their busy signal sounds strange. I decide that their phone is out of order. For this reason, I feel grateful that Mrs. Cushel is going to help me with posters. She said she'll put an ad in the paper for me too, and on some of the websites about lost and found pets. We run into a problem right away, though. This is the conversation in which I realize the problem. Mrs. Kushel, now, the first thing you must do is take a picture of the dog you found. A picture is even better than describing the dog. Rose Howard, a picture. Mrs. Kushel, yes. Can you do that? I can, but I don't want to. I don't want Mrs. Cushel to see that the picture is of Rain. I nod my head. Mrs. Kushel, good. Now, under the picture we should write, found, and then you can describe the dog. Rose Howard, even though there's a picture of the dog right there. Mrs. Kushel, yes. You can give a few more details, such as the dog's approximate age and weight, and also where you found the dog. Rose Howard, oh, I decide that maybe we should wait a bit before we put up posters of Rain. I'm not ready to explain things to Mrs. Cushel, but I am ready to tell my new plan to Uncle Weldon. I call him one night and say, I think we need to look for the Hendersons. Who? He asks. Rain's real owners. It's only right. And only fair. Rules are rules. No name calling. Put away the math game when you aren't using it because someone who finished her worksheets might be waiting for it. And, Uncle Weldon interrupts me. And make sure Rain's original owners get their dog back. Yes, I say. Oh, Rose. Are you sure you want to do this? We practically stole her, I reply in a small voice. Now don't get carried away. I'm patting Rain while we talk. I'm not carried away. I add, I have another plan. I tell Uncle Weldon that I secretly know the Hendersons' address in Gloverstown. We could start by looking for their house. Maybe they still live there but their phone is just out of order after the storm. We decide to go to Gloverstown the next day, which is Saturday. We get an early start. My father is barely out of bed. We leave him sitting at the kitchen table in his underwear, muttering and grunting and calling the people at the JR garage bad names. Gloverstown is about 30 miles from Hatford in the opposite direction from Elmira. It's one of the towns that got hit the worst by Susan, Uncle Weldon comments as we drive along. I don't think there's much left of it. He's right. When we reach what used to be the main street through Gloverstown, we see that it now looks like a dried-up riverbed. And everything on either side of it is ruined and abandoned. Wooden porches droop and dip, their railings missing. The sidewalks are gone, and broken store windows have been patched with tape, but carelessly, as if the owners don't expect to be able to salvage their businesses. We don't see a single person. Uncle Weldon skirts around the town and finally we come across the road where the Hendersons live. It's a lonely country road and we don't see any houses, although we see a lot of storm damage. Finally we spot a mailbox with the excellent prime number 2 painted on the side. That's it, I say. Uncle Weldon turns onto a gravel drive and we creep along, avoiding potholes and tree limbs. We round a bend. Whoa, says Uncle Weldon under his breath. The house that once stood there, Rain's old home, is now a pile of lumber and rubble, surrounded by fallen trees. We get out of the car and listen to the country sounds of branches rustling and birds chirping. Uncle Weldon calls, hello. No one answers. We get in the car and drive back toward town. 38 The general store in Gloverstown. Do you think they're all right? I ask Uncle Weldon as we drive along. The Hendersons? I don't know. I hope they went to a shelter before the storm hit. How will we find them? I ask. Uncle Weldon shakes his head. Let me think about this. We drive back to Gloverstown, past the end of the ruined Main Street, and are about to turn onto Route 28, when I say, hey, a little country store sits by the side of the road. It looks just like a house, a white house with black shutters, a wide front porch and a brick chimney. But a sign above the door reads General Store. Can we stop here? I ask. Sure. Are you hungry? No. I have an idea. Uncle Weldon follows me inside. The store is crammed with shelf after shelf of everything you can think of. Nails, board games, cans of soup, t-shirts, batteries, aspirin, cereal, band-aids, pens, candy bars, thread, socks. Can I help you? Standing behind the counter is a young man wearing overalls and a flannel shirt. My heart starts to pound, but I step up to the counter anyway, and I say, "My name is Rose Howard and I'm looking for the Hendersons who used to live at number 2 Slide Road." The man frowns and I think maybe he's going to ask why I want to find the Hendersons. Instead he says, Henderson, Jason and Carol Henderson, and a couple of little kids. I remember the names Jason and Carol from the microchip information, so I say, yes. Didn't know them well. Didn't know them. They had to move away after the storm. Too much damage to their house. I let out a breath. So they're still alive. Do you know where they went? I ask. The man shakes his head. No, but they have relatives somewhere around here. Maybe they're staying with them. Okay. I glare into the man's eyes and say, thank you. Uncle Weldon and I are on our way out of the store when I see a rack of newspapers, including one called the County Gazette. I point to a copy. Uncle Weldon, could we buy that? Sure. But why? If we put an ad in it, maybe the Hendersons will see it. 39 found. Blonde female dog. Halloween came and went, and now Thanksgiving comes and goes. My father and Rain and I have a turkey dinner at Uncle Weldon's house. Over the weekend I think a lot about the Hendersons. I decide that I must tell Mrs. Cushel the truth about Rain. So on Monday I ask my uncle if he can drop me off at school early again. It's time for another private conversation with my teacher. I enter our classroom and find Mrs. Cushel working on a new bulletin board. She's tacking up large colorful letters that spell holidays. Good morning, Rose, she says. Good morning, I reply, looking her in the eye. Mrs. Cushel steps off the chair she's been standing on. Is there something you'd like to talk about? She asks. Did you bring the photo of the dog you found? She has asked 2 questions in a row. I answer the first one. There is something I'd like to talk about. I sit at my desk and Mrs. Cushel sits next to me in Mrs. Liebler's chair. I have to tell you something, I say. I have to tell you the truth. Mrs. Cushel smiles at me, which is a sign of encouragement. The truth is that the lost dog is Rain. Mrs. Cushel's smile turns to a frown. I don't understand. I tell my teacher the whole story of Rain, starting from the night my father brought her home and said we couldn't look for her owners if she didn't have any identification. So Rain is back, I finish up. But she isn't my dog, and we have to find her real owners, the Hendersons who used to live in Gloverstown, whose house got ruined, and who might be living nearby with relatives. Just like Uncle Weldon, Mrs. Cushel says to me, "Oh, Rose. Are you sure?" I nod my head. Yes, I am sure. It's the right thing to do. Happy Tales is looking for her owners too. Mrs. Cushel frowns again, and taps a pencil on the edge of my desk. This is an indication that she's thinking. She says, I have an idea. Instead of placing an ad in the paper, maybe someone could write an article. An article would get a lot of attention, certainly more attention than a little ad. I'll have to ask your father for permission, of course, Mrs. Cushel continues. She sounds as though she's talking to herself. Then I'll call a friend of mine, Sheila Perlman, who's a writer. She'll write a good story, and it would probably be picked up by lots of the local papers. How do you feel about this, Rose? I feel that it's a good idea. I'll call your father tonight. Maybe you should call him in the afternoon, I say, thinking of all the time my father has been spending at the Luck of the Irish lately. The earlier she talks to him, the less chance there is that he will have had a drink already. Deal, says Mrs. Cushel. 3 days later I arrive at school wearing the same dress I wore on school picture day. My hair is brushed and Uncle Weldon tied a ribbon in it. When it's time for recess, my classmates leave the cafeteria and run to the playground, while Mrs. Cushel and I walk back to our room. Waiting there is a woman wearing a blue wool jacket and matching blue wool pants. Her face looks serious, but when she sees me she smiles. Rose, says Mrs. Cushel, meet Ms. Perlman. She's the writer. Ms. Perlman, this is Rose Howard. Ms. Perlman stretches out her hand and I know I'm supposed to shake it, which I do. Well, says my teacher, shall we get down to business? Ms. Perlman opens a laptop computer. She starts asking me questions. Questions about Rain, about when my father brought her home, about how we lost her and how we found her. And then more questions about what happened after we located her at Happy Tales. I give her a photo of Rain that Uncle Weldon took with his digital camera. Ms. Perlman looks at the photo, looks at me, looks at the photo again, and when she glances at me a second time I think I see tears in her eyes. "This is a very brave and selfless thing you're doing, Rose," she says. "Giving up the dog you love so that her proper owners can be reunited with her." I nod. Maybe I'm supposed to say thank you. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. When I say nothing, Ms. Perlman says to Mrs. Cushel, "At the end of the article we'll include a contact number, a number at the Hatford Herald, that people can call if they have any information about Rain or the Hendersons. That way Rose's personal information will remain private." Mrs. Cushel nods. "I'll explain that to Rose's FA," she pauses. "I think I'll explain it to her uncle, when he picks her up today." Ms. Perlman turns to me and smiles. "That about wraps things up. Thank you very much, Rose." "You're very welcome, Ms. Perlman," I reply, and stick out my hand so she can shake it again. 40 Parvani finds a homonym. Writing compositions in Mrs. Cushel's class. Christmas and Hanukkah are almost here, but when Mrs. Cushel asked what we would like to write about, every single one of us said, Hurricane Susan. We are not finished thinking about our ruined homes and wrecked artwork, our washed-away bridges and lost dogs. I don't know exactly what the subject of Parvani's composition is, but suddenly she shoots her hand in the air and says, "Mrs. Cushel. What's that word you taught us that means to tear something down?" Mrs. Cushel puts on her thoughtful face and taps her pencil against her fingers. "Raise?" she suggests after a moment. "Yes," exclaims Parvani. And then she can't help herself. She jumps out of her seat, runs to my desk, and cries, "Rose, I thought of a triple homonym, raise, raise, and raise. I have thought of that triple homonym before, but I know this is not the time to mention it. Instead, this is the time for the feeling of friendliness. Since a friend would probably not say, 'I already thought of that,' I grin at Parvani and exclaim, 'That's a great one.' I put enthusiasm into my voice. Parvani places her palm in the air. "High five," she says. I give her a high five, and then we go back to our compositions. We are both smiling. 41 My father makes a mistake with pronouns. What is this? My father is asking the question. This is not when he makes a mistake with pronouns. He's holding out a newspaper. Uncle Weldon has just dropped me off after school, and I'm walking through the front door, Rain at my side because she's been waiting for me on the porch. "It's a newspaper," I say. My father's face is hard and there's no smile on it. "Of course it's a newspaper," he replies. He throws it at my feet. "Sam Diamond gave it to me this morning. He said there was something in it that I would want to see." He was right. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" I feel confused, but more than that, I feel frightened. "No," I say. My father picks the paper up and turns the pages so fiercely that they rip in his hands. He turns the pages 3 times and then he stops and shoves one of them at me. "What is this?" It's the second time he's asked that question. I look at the page. I see a picture of Rain. And an article, a long one, titled, "A Girl's Brave Search." The author of the article is Sheila Perlman. "It's the article Mrs. Cushel called you about," I tell my father. "Nobody called me about any article." I hand the paper back to him. "Mrs. Cushel did." My father pauses for a long time and his eyes wander around the room. I know he's suddenly remembering the afternoon when he came home from the Luck of the Irish and the phone rang. He picked it up and said hello, and then he frowned and the next thing he said was, "What did Rose do? Is she in trouble again?" He put his hand over the mouthpiece and whispered to me, "It's Mrs. Cushel." "Okay," I said. My father reached for the remote control and aimed it at the television. He pressed the mute button and flicked silently through channels. Every now and then he said, "UNH," or, "Aha," into the phone. Eventually, he hung up. "What did you tell your teacher about Rain for?" he asked me before he turned the volume back on. Now my father shakes his head. This is our private business, Rose. Our private family business. And now it's all over the paper. Everyone in the county will read this. I look like a thief. I back away. Rain backs away too. She does not take her eyes off my father. Talk to Uncle Weldon, I say. I know my uncle hasn't had time to return to his office yet, but I don't want my father to call Mrs. Cushel and yell at her. I need to take Rain for a walk, I add. Let's call Uncle Weldon when I get back. I hustle Rain outside and we walk up and down the street until I think Uncle Weldon is at his desk at work. Then we cross the planks into our yard again. My father is sitting at the kitchen table, doing nothing. I pick up the phone and dial Uncle Weldon's number. I tell him what's happened and he says, "Let me speak to your father, please." I feel a little mad at my father now, so I stand by the table, staring at him and listening to his end of the conversation. At first he doesn't say much, but then he shouts, "Okay, I won't phone anyone. I won't make any trouble." He hangs up without saying goodbye to Uncle Weldon. Then he looks at me. "Sit down, Rose." I don't want to sit near my father. "Where?" I say. My father kicks a chair away from the table. "Right there." I perch on the edge of the chair. "Why are you doing this, Rose? Why are you looking for Rain's owners? She was my gift to you. My gift. Not to mention that you got her twice. Once from me and once from the shelter. You should count your lucky stars. But if you hadn't let Rain out during a superstorm, I say, I wouldn't have had to get her back." I look down at Rain, then up at my father again. "Why did you let her outside during the storm? Rose, for the love of Pete." I see color rising in my father's face. "But why did you?" Rain had never been outside during a storm before. Not by herself. When my father speaks again, his voice is very low, but not in a gentle way like when Mrs. Cushel reads to our class. It's a different kind of low. "You should count your lucky stars and your blessings, Rose. You have your frickin' dog back. This is not logical. I wouldn't have had to get her back if you hadn't let her out. Why did you let her out?" My father slams his hand down on the table so suddenly and so hard that Rain and I jump. "Look, you little brat. I brought that home for you." He points to Rain. "I was trying to do something nice. Rain is a she, I inform him, not a that." My father gets to his feet and stands over me. 42 protecting Rain. "What did you say?" my father asks. I shake my head. He's so much bigger than I am. I hadn't noticed. I hadn't noticed how thick and hard his hands are, how wide his shoulders are. 2, 3, 5, 7. "Answer me," my father says in that same low voice. I slip off the edge of my chair and sidestep toward my bedroom. "Come here." "No." "All right." My father takes 2 giant steps toward me, his arm raised, his fingers clenched into a fist. I can see each white knuckle, as hard as a stone. He's never raised his fist to me. Not once that I remember. This is because of not wanting to be the kind of father that his father was. I'm looking from my bedroom door to the front door, trying to decide which one is closer, when a blur of blonde fur hurtles into the air and leaps against my father's chest, growling. "Rain," I cry. She lands on the floor and gets ready to spring again, but before she can, my father lowers his fist. He brings it down on Rain's back and she lurches sideways and crashes into the legs of the table. I hear a crunch, and Rain's yelp of fear and pain. I turn and fling myself beneath the table so fast I skin my knees on the floorboards. I gather Rain into my arms and slide us under the very center of the table. My father reaches for us and I scoot us away from his grasp, again and again, like we are targets in a game. "Don't touch her," I cry. "Do not touch her, do not hurt her." I won't let go of Rain. After a few moments the hand disappears. I hear footsteps crossing the room to the front door. The knob begins to turn, then stops. I slide forward a few inches and peer out from under the table. "If you say one word about this to anyone, Rose, one word," my father is breathing heavily. He has to pause before he can continue speaking. "If you say one word to Weldon, to Mrs. Cushel," his gaze drifts to Rain who, although she's trembling, has also poked her head out from under the table. He glares at her. He doesn't finish his sentence. He doesn't have to. I slide Rain behind me so that she's out of his sight. My father grabs his keys and slams the front door behind him. I hold Rain for a long time. We're breathing heavily too. My breath comes in gasps, and Rain pants and drools. When I hear Sam Diamond's car start up, I crawl out from under the table. I pull Rain after me and we sit on the couch. I pat her whole body, over and over. Nothing seems to hurt her. I make her walk across the floor. She doesn't limp. Later I feed Rain her dinner. I walk her earlier than usual, even though this is an unwelcome change in our schedule, and then I close her into my room. I wonder how I'll be able to protect her when I'm at school. I'm still up when my father comes home. I'm sitting in the living room with the TV on. My father stands before me and says, "I'm sorry, Rose. It won't happen again." I look into his eyes. I don't know how to read what I see there, so I say nothing. "Really?" my father continues. "I'm very sorry. Very, very sorry." "Okay," I say. This may be a sincere apology. 43 What Mrs. Cushel says. Time passes in school the way it always does. Mrs. Cushel changes the bulletin board from holidays to we are all artists. Some of the snow melts and for a while the playground is muddy and wet instead of snowy and wet. The next holiday will be Martin Luther King Jr. Day. On a morning that is dark and rainy and chilly, Mrs. Liebler walks me to our classroom as usual. But something that is not usual is that Mrs. Cushel takes me to the back of the room as soon as I have hung up my coat and put my things in my desk. "I want to speak with you privately, Rose," she says. I wonder if I have done something that she and Mrs. Liebler will write about in the weekly note to my father. "Okay," I say, and think about homonyms. Tide and Tide is a new one. I wanted to let you know that the newspaper got a call about rain yesterday. Tide, tide. Died, died. Are you listening to me, Rose? Yes. A man named Jason Henderson phoned. He said someone had just sent him the article and that Rain is his family's dog. The newspaper put him in touch with Happy Tales, and Mrs. Caporal is certain that he and his family are Rain's original owners. All their information matches up with the information from Rain's chip. Also, they have lots of photos of themselves with Rain. Mrs. Cushel pauses and looks at me seriously. I don't know whether this is good news for you or bad news. The article worked, I say. Yes, it did. Would you like to know how Rain got separated from the Hendersons? Yes. They always took her collar off when she was in the house so that it wouldn't get snagged on anything. One day the Hendersons went out and left Rain at home alone. A neighbor dropped by to leave something in their kitchen and Rain slipped outside without her collar. The neighbor didn't see her leave, so it was several hours before anyone knew she was missing. This happened 2 days before your father found her, Rose. The Hendersons weren't irresponsible after all, I say. It was an accident. Rain left their house without her collar, just like she left our house after the storm without her collar. Yes, a sad accident. We'll never know how Rain wound up so far from home, but she did. The Hendersons looked for her in their town. They put up flyers and placed an ad in the paper, but no one called to say they had found her. Because we had her, Mrs. Cushel cocks her head to the side. But now you've done a very brave thing, like Ms. Perlman said. Okay, the rest of the story you learned yourself. The Hendersons had to abandon their home after the storm, and they're living with relatives now. That's why it was so hard to locate them. Mrs. Cushel pauses. They want Rain back, Rose. They love her and miss her and want her very badly. Okay, 44 Goodbye. The very next day Uncle Weldon picks me up from school, as usual. He drives me home, as usual. When we reach our house, I cross the planks as usual, and I see Rain watching me from a window. What is not usual is that Uncle Weldon is still sitting in the truck. He's waiting for Rain and me. I put my school things inside. Then I clip Rain's leash to her collar and walk her around the yard for a while. She pees and poops, and sniffs at her favorite things, a stump, the bottom porch step, a particular spot near the garage door. Uncle Weldon watches us from the truck. My father is not at home. He's probably at the Luck of the Irish. But I can tell that he was working on the new bridge this morning. I think my father doesn't want to say goodbye to Rain. I lead Rain to the truck. She sits between Uncle Weldon and me as we drive along. She looks out the window seriously. The other day Mrs. Liebler told me to try to see things from someone else's perspective. Put yourself in that person's place, Rose, she said. What do you think she's thinking? What is she feeling? I'm not sure what Rain is thinking or feeling now, but she looks like she's watching the road for people who are making driving mistakes. Uncle Weldon and Rain and I ride to Happy Tales. We don't say much. Our space in the truck is very quiet. I stroke the white toes on Rain's front feet. Her toes are as soft as pussy willows. Uncle Weldon turns onto the drive to Happy Tales. He parks the truck and then he looks at me for a long time. Are you all right, Rose? He asks. I stare out the window and remember my father whacking Rain on the back and fishing for us under the table. I think the Hendersons will take good care of her, I reply. I help Rain out of the truck and lead her along the walk to the door of Happy Tales. Rain starts to shake, which makes me believe that she remembers Happy Tales and that she isn't happy to be back here. Beyond that, I don't know what she's feeling. Mrs. Caporal is waiting for Uncle Weldon and Rain and me at the door. She puts her arm across my shoulder. You're making 4 people very happy, Rose, she says. What you're doing is honorable and brave. Everyone calls me brave. Is this what bravery feels like? Come into my office, Mrs. Caporal continues. The Hendersons are there. I look up at my uncle and he offers me a smile. Then he puts his hand on my back and we follow Mrs. Caporal through a doorway. Sitting on chairs in the small office are a man, a woman, a girl who is about my age, and a boy who is probably the prime number age of 7. They're sitting silently, but when they see Rain they all jump to their feet, and then the girl and boy slide onto their knees and throw their arms around Rain. Olivia, the girl, cries. The boy doesn't say anything. He buries his face in Rain's fur. The woman starts to cry so I don't look at her anymore. I watch Rain. She sat quietly at first, but now she's standing up and wiggling. Not shaking, wiggling. Every inch of her. She licks the boy's face and then the girl's face. She leaps up against the man's legs. The woman kneels down and Rain puts her paws on her shoulders. She whines in her happy way and then she jumps down and dances back and forth, sticking her snout in the Hendersons' HNDS. This is Happy Rain. And these are happy people, I think. I remember what their house looked like. I try to think about things from the boys' and the girls' perspectives. I decide that they must have been as sad to lose Rain as I was, and that they must feel as happy now as I did on the day Uncle Weldon and I first came to Happy Tales. I think that they still don't have their home, but now they have their dog back. When Rain stops dancing around and the room grows quieter, Mrs. Caporal brings out some papers for Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. They sign him and then for a moment everyone stands still looking at one another. I drop my eyes to Rain. Mrs. Henderson crosses the little room and puts her arms around me. I hold very still, my arms at my sides, while she hugs me. Thank you, Rose, she says. Yes, thank you, says her husband. He looks like maybe he's going to hug me too, but he changes his mind and smiles at me instead. Thank you, say the girl and the boy, whose names, I know now, are Jean and Toby. I think for a moment and then I say, you're welcome, and I stare at each one of the Hendersons. Uncle Weldon clears his throat. Well, he says, I should get you home, Rose. He turns to the Hendersons. Would it be possible for Rose to have a few minutes alone with Rain? Of course, says Mr. Henderson, and everyone leaves the room except for Rain and me. Rain is sitting on her haunches in the middle of the floor. She's still very excited, and when I sit down next to her she jumps to her feet and puts her face against mine, breathing hard. That's your family, I say finally. You're going to go home with them. Rain continues to gaze at me. I wrap my arms around her and feel her soft fur against my cheek. I love you, I tell her. Rain leans into me and we sit that way until I hear a knock on the door. Rose? Calls Uncle Weldon. We need to leave now. So do the Hendersons. Have you said goodbye? Yes. I stand up and lead Rain through the door. She sees the Hendersons and runs to them. They call goodbye and say thank you to me several more times. I stand at the window in happy tales and watch Rain climb into the Hendersons' car. Then I watch the car pull out of the lot and turn onto the drive. I can see Rain's head in the window, her long proud snout, and her pink nose that is the exact color of an eraser. Jean Henderson leans over and whispers in Rain's ear, and Rain cocks her head to the side. The car turns a corner and Rain disappears. 5. The last part. 45. The quiet house. The bulletin board in our classroom changes to spring is coming, the air grows warmer. My father finishes the bridge and now he can drive our truck over it. Sam Diamond takes his car back. The afternoons at my house are quiet. My father says he is out looking for work. When I am at home alone, I study my list of homonyms. I look through my mother's box. That is all. There is an ache inside of me, a pain. Is this what bravery feels like? Or loneliness? Maybe this is an ache of sadness. 46. My father has an argument with his brother. On a day when the grass in our yard is more green than brown, and the air is warm and smells sweet, and the branches on the trees are fuzzy with new leaves, Uncle Weldon drives me home from Hatford Elementary. He drives across the finished bridge and parks the truck. My father is standing at the front of his own truck, tinkering with things under the hood. He hasn't been back to the JR garage since the day Jerry Frickin fired him. He works on his truck and in the yard now that the bridge is finished. I do not think his job search is going well. One afternoon last week when Uncle Weldon was driving me home, I said, I guess my father could drive me to school and back now. He still doesn't have a job. Uncle Weldon started shaking his head before I even finished speaking. Let's not mention that, he replied. That's what I was hoping he would say. Okay, we rode for a little while longer and then I said, from my father's perspective, I don't think he wants to run into Mrs. Cushel or Mrs. Liebler. Seeing them once a month is enough for him. I think you're exactly right. Now on this spring day I climb out of the truck. Then Uncle Weldon climbs out of the truck. This is unusual. Hey, Wes, my uncle says. My father steps away from the hood and straightens up. He wipes his hands on a rag that is hanging out of one pocket. Hey, do you have a minute? Asks Uncle Weldon. I guess. My father looks wary. Well, I've been thinking. Rose here should have another dog. Don't you agree? I take a step backward. I didn't say that, I tell my father. Nope, says Uncle Weldon calmly. This is all my idea. My father snorts. Rose here didn't appreciate the dog she had, the one I got her. She gave it back. She gave it back when she could have kept it. Rain is a she, not in it. My father is angry. Rain wasn't her dog, my uncle replies. She could have kept it, my father repeats. She didn't have to go looking for the owners. Uncle Weldon clenches his jaw. I take another step backward. I was just trying to do something nice for her, says my father. I got her a dog and she gave it back. The one great thing I did. The one great thing. Look, Wesley. Not another word. I mean it. Not another word. When my father says not another word, he does mean it. Uncle Weldon retreats to his truck, opens the front door, and slides behind the wheel. Just think about it. Rose has so lit, he catches himself. It's lonely for her. I mean, when you aren't around. Rose is fine. She has all she needs here. She's just fine. But a dog, you think you know best. You don't know best. My father slaps his hands on the side of his truck. Uncle Weldon sits motionless behind the wheel. My mind is whirling. I try to send a message to my uncle. Please don't say another word. Not another word. If my father forbids Uncle Weldon to see me, then I will have nothing left. My uncle opens his mouth. Are you sure you know what's best for Rose? He asks quietly. My father pulls a wrench out of his pocket. He aims it at the windshield of Uncle Weldon's truck, but then he lowers his arm to his side. He puts the wrench back in his pocket, shakes his head once, and gets to work under the hood again. His hands are trembling. Uncle Weldon puts his truck in reverse and begins to turn around. He waves to me through the window, and I give him a small wave back. Then I run to my bedroom and close the door. 47 In the middle of the night, on nights when I have trouble falling asleep, I lie very still on my back and pick a number. The more awake I am, the higher the number I choose. Then I silently count backwards by 3. One warm night when rain is dripping softly off the roof of the house, I have been lying in bed for nearly an hour and a half and I am still not at all sleepy. I think about school. I think about rain. I think about Parvani, who now tells me every time she finds new homonyms. I think about rain some more. Sleep will not come. 495, 492, 489, 486, 483. I am in the 350s when I start to make mistakes. Finally I feel floaty and drift to sleep. Bang, the door to my room flies open and in the doorway I see the shape of my father silhouetted by light from the living room. I look at my clock. I have been asleep for less than 20 minutes. My father flicks on my light. I'm taking you to Weldon's, he announces. Right now. I raise myself up on my elbows. The time on my clock is 12:02. Why is my father up and dressed at this hour? He hasn't been to the Luck of the Irish tonight. What? I say, but my father is already crossing the living room. I hear the front door open. I think about what he just said. I'm taking you to Weldon's. Not, we're going to Weldon's, but, I'm taking you to Weldon's. This sounds like I'm the only one going to my uncle's house. It sounds like I might stay there for a while. I hurry into the kitchen and grab a garbage bag from under the sink. I hear banging noises outside, as if objects are being thrown into the back of the truck. I whisk the bag into my room and stuff clothes into it, as many as I can grab quickly. I set my backpack next to the garbage bag. I make sure my homonyms list is in the backpack. I'm sliding my mother's box off the shelf in the coat closet when I hear my father shout, "Rose, get out here right now." I scramble into the truck with the garbage bag, the backpack, and my mother's box. My father is hurtling down the driveway before I have even closed my door. I'm still fastening my seat belt as we fly across the bridge and start down Hud Road. In the back of the truck things slide from side to side, bags, a suitcase, a cardboard box. Why are we going to Uncle Weldon's? I ask. My father doesn't answer. He's peering ahead through the windshield at the rain, which is falling harder now. His face is like stone, not soft and slack like when he's been drinking. He doesn't turn to look at me. He drives straight and sure and carefully. Why are we going to Uncle Weldon's? I ask again. Once in music class, our teacher showed us a tuning fork. He struck it on the edge of a desk and let us take turns putting our hands on it to feel the vibrations. The air in the truck now is like the tuning fork, vibrating. It continues to vibrate after I ask my question the second time and still get no answer. We ride in silence in the charged atmosphere, through the dark streets of Hatford, our headlights shining on the falling rain, the slick trees, and once, the eyes of a raccoon hesitating at the side of the road. Does Uncle Weldon know I'm coming? I ask as we turn into his driveway. My father brings the truck to a halt, but doesn't turn the engine off. He reaches across me and opens my door. Go now, he says. Then he does something he hasn't done in a long time. He gives me a hug, a quick hug. When his cheek rests against mine I can feel wetness. He turns and faces front, his jaw working. I climb out of the truck and pull my things after me. I run through the rain to Uncle Weldon's front porch. By the time I turn around, the tail lights of the truck are disappearing down the drive. I ring my uncle's bell. I ring it again and again. The porch light comes on and I see Uncle Weldon's face in the window by the door. 1 second later the door is flung wide open. "Rose," he exclaims. "What on earth?" I step toward him. "My father is gone," I say. We are just swinging quietly on this Sunday when Uncle Weldon says to me, "When should we visit Happy Tales again?" I glance at him. "Well, don't you think it's time for another visit? There are probably some new dogs up for adoption." "I don't know. Come on." Uncle Weldon smiles at me. "Just another look. A little peek. Wouldn't it be nice to sit out here with a dog between us?" A dog on a swing. Now I smile. Maybe we could go next weekend. Uncle Weldon holds out his hand and I shake it. We have made a deal. I thought of a new homonym last night, I say. It's a good one. Wade and Wade. That is a good one, my uncle agrees. Was there room on your list? Yes. You know who else has a homonyms list now? Know who? Parvani. I'm going to call her and tell her about Wade and Wade. Uncle Weldon brings the swing to a stop and we cross our fingers and touch our hearts. I look across the field again and then up to the sky, which is a vast pale blue. I remember the music festival, and the notes that soared above our heads. I think about the homonyms sword and sword. They're an interesting pair, because sword is a very nice word, especially when you imagine musical notes swooshing through the evening air, but sword indicates weaponry, so that isn't a nice word at all. That's one of the many things I like about homonyms. Most of them seem unrelated, some seem to be opposites, like sword and sword, but a few make lovely connections if you're open to changing your perspective when you think about them. I stand up, then squint my eyes shut for a moment, remembering the night, with Uncle Weldon when the music soared, through the air, and the notes and the sky and our hearts were one. Authors note the tale of Rose and Rain began in 2011 after Hurricane Irene swept up the east coast of the United States and made an unexpected inland turn. After the storm I walked along my road in upstate New York, day after day, watching as downed tea wreaths were cleared from yards, roofs were reshingled, and washed-out bridges and stone walls were rebuilt. My dog, Sadie, was at my side and I thought about pets who had become separated from their owners during the storm. I began to spin a tale about a lost dog. At the same time, Rose began to make her presence known to me. She was a young girl on the autism spectrum, a girl who's verbal and bright and whose dog is the center of her baffling and sometimes unpleasant world. Slowly the elements of the story, Rose, Rain, and the storm, came together. Writing can be a solitary business, but most stories are a group effort. Many thanks to my editors, Liz Sabler and Jean Fievel, for their insights, their patience, and their faith, and for encouraging me to dig deeper. And thank you to my friend Jamie Wolfe, co-founder and program director of the Center for Spectrum Services in New York's Hudson Valley. The center serves students on the autism spectrum. Jamie graciously allowed me to spend a morning at the school in Kingston, talking with students, observing the interaction between students and teachers, and asking Jamie question after question. When the rough draft of the story was finished, Jamie was one of the first to read it. Her help was invaluable. Finally, thank you to sweet Sadie, who introduced me to the world of dogs, and whose behavior I observed every day of her 15 years. She was by my side as I wrote the story, and was a daily inspiration. 48 What happened to my mother? Uncle Weldon and I sit on his front porch on a day that seems too hot for early June. There are still 2 more weeks of school, and every morning Mrs. Cushel opens the windows in our classroom wide, even though bees and flies come in and hum around our heads all day long. I jiggle my feet up and down and watch a hummingbird hover by a geranium plant. It's Saturday morning. Uncle Weldon has just said, "Let's put on our thinking caps." I glance at him. Why? We need to figure out what to bring to your school party. We are going to have a party in Mrs. Cushel's room to celebrate the last day of school. Cookies, I suggest. Chocolate chip cookies. Uncle Weldon smiles. Good idea. We'll go to the store next week and buy the ingredients. We fall silent again. Sometimes Uncle Weldon and I just sit quietly for long periods of time. We like that. Sitting and thinking. Every evening we make dinner together and every morning we talk about homonyms. On the weekends we go for rides in his truck, to the state park, to the museum in Ashford, to an outdoor music festival. When we were at the festival, we spread a blanket on the ground and lay on our backs, listening to an orchestra. Try to pick out the sounds each instrument makes, Uncle Weldon said. Listen for the violin, listen for the trombone, listen for the clarinet. The notes soared into the sky, up to the stars. On this hot June morning, the hummingbird darting from one flower to another, I suddenly say, Uncle Weldon, from my mother's perspective, when she went away, why do you think she left her memories behind? Uncle Weldon cocks his head at me the way Rain used to do. What do you mean? He asks. I tell him about the box. She left all her Rose things behind. Why didn't she take them with her? Didn't she want to remember me? Now my uncle frowns. Rose, he says, do you think your mother walked away from you and your dad? Is that what your father told you? Yes. Yes, I say, since my uncle has asked me 2 questions in a row. Uncle Weldon's face is soft and gentle. He reaches a hand toward me, touches my knee, pulls his hand back. Your mother didn't leave, he says. She died. When you were very young. She's dead? Yes. How did she die? She had an aneurysm in her heart. She died very quickly. Why did my father tell me she left us? Uncle Weldon shakes his head. He sips his coffee. Maybe he was trying to shield you. Maybe he thought you would be too sad if you knew she had died. But he let me think she left us. I thought she left because of me. Uncle Weldon touches my knee again, which is all right. It's just a little touch. Your father didn't always make smart choices, he says, but he did try to do right by you. Is that why he left? My uncle looks at the hummingbird. He shakes his head again. I don't know. We didn't talk about it, your father and I, but I think he thought you'd be better off with me. Was it hard for him to leave? Yes, I think it was. So my father and I have something else in common. We are both brave. 49 Hud Road. That summer is one of the hottest anyone can remember. Uncle Weldon buys a big wooden swing that we paint green before hanging it on the front porch. We sit on it every evening while we wait for the air to cool, Uncle Weldon rocking us lazily back and forth, his foot pushing off from the geranium pot. We sit on the swing most mornings too, even weekday mornings before we leave for Uncle Weldon's day at work and my day at a program called Summertime Academy, where I meet other kids with the official diagnosis of high-functioning autism. One Sunday morning we're on the swing and I'm looking across a dusty golden field and through some trees to a road that, if you followed it for 2.3 miles, would lead to Hud. Uncle Weldon and I visited my old house several days ago. We looked through the windows at the empty rooms. Uncle Weldon ran his hand thoughtfully over the foreclosure notice tacked to the front door. We haven't heard from my father since the night he left me with Uncle Weldon, so we were the ones who cleared the house out last month. I didn't want to keep anything except Rain's belongings, her leash and bowl and toys. I put them in a bag under my bed.